Yesterday, the Deputy Premier failed to answer basic questions about the appointment of returning officers for the last election. On an issue that important, the Deputy Premier needs to be open and accountable to Albertans. So my question is back to the Deputy Premier. How does he justify to this Assembly a policy in which 6 written requests from the Chief Electoral Officer, an officer of this Assembly, are ignored? Key non-partisan responsibility of appointing returning officers is turned over to a political party.
The Honourable Deputy.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I think the Justice Minister should respond to this.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've had the opportunity to review the suggestions that have been made by the honourable member. Our records do indicate that responses were made appropriately at the time, that requests made by the Chief Electoral Officer were responded to, and that's all we could do.
The honourable member.
That's pretty pathetic then, isn't it? Mr. Speaker, the Chief Electoral Officer contacted this government 6 different times in writing about appointing returning officers, and the Deputy Premier was the person receiving those submissions. So does the Deputy Premier really expect Albertans to believe that he cannot remember this happening, or is he simply hiding the truth?
Well, actually, if we look at Beauchesne, and we look at Beauchesne 409.6, it says a question must be within the administrative competence of the government. The minister to whom the question is directed is responsible to the House for his or her present ministry and not for any decisions taken in a previous portfolio. So it's appropriate that the Minister of Justice and the Attorney General be the one who responds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I understood the question to be, or the suggestion to be, that the government did not respond to the request, and I'm advising the House that it is my information as Minister of Justice that we did respond to the request.
The honourable member.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. To the Minister of Justice, is she saying that in testimony last week the Chief Electoral Officer lied or misled the Legislative Offices Committee when he indicated he did not receive a response from the then Justice Minister?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
I won't draw a conclusion either way, Mr. Speaker. I will simply advise the House that it is my information, and I have been advised that we did respond to the request.
The Honourable Member for Calgary-Buffalo, followed by the Honourable Member for Athabasca.
Mr. Speaker, when allegations of tampering with evidence emerged in a Freedom of Information case relating to flight logs, the Minister of Justice appointed a special prosecutor. This move, for which I applaud her, ensured someone separate and apart from the government investigated these concerns. To the Minister of Justice, given that having free and fair elections, the protection of democracy, should be a priority #1 for any Justice Minister, why wasn't a special prosecutor brought in to investigate the 19 election violations recommended for prosecution by the just-let-go Chief Electoral Officer?
The Honourable Minister of Justice and Attorney General.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I said yesterday in this House, we have a process with an independent prosecution service that conducts their work efficiently, effectively. They balance the needs of the justice system. They balance the needs of prosecutions. They make decisions as to whether or not prosecution should take place. And in cases where there could be a perceived conflict of interest, a special prosecutor could be appointed. That is not the case in these circumstances.
The Honourable Member.
I understand what the Minister is saying, but why wouldn't there be a conflict of interest when we have election violations that could be happening of any party, including the Honourable Minister's party that runs the government? Why wouldn't there be a perceived conflict of interest?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think that it is very important, as I said yesterday in this House, to recall that one of the conditions that prosecutors must consider when they're deciding whether or not to prosecute a case is to look at the circumstances and determine whether or not the situation can be corrected without a prosecution so that we are not inadvertently persecuting people that perhaps made honest mistakes. It is my understanding from discussions with my department and the advice that I've received on the conversations that were held with the Chief Electoral Officer that in the cases where the Chief Electoral Officer brought this information to the attention of the prosecutors, that the situations were resolved, that inadvertent errors were corrected, and the matters were dealt with.
The Honourable Member.
Well, thank you very much. Nevertheless, it didn't quite answer the question. What I asked was, how can it not be a conflict of interest when the Minister's Department is investigating alleged election violations that could have been committed by our own party? How is it not a classic case of a conflict of interest?
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would start by saying the question has been asked and answered, but I will actually supplement, and I will say that within the Department of Justice, we have strong prosecutors who make decisions on their own, of their own volition, as to whether or not to prosecute cases, and they made decisions not to do that.
Honourable Member, followed by the Honourable Member for Cardston Table Warner.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This morning we learned the government has a financial deficit. Last night we learned, unfortunately, the government has a democratic deficit when they fired the Chief Electoral Officer of this province. Mr. Gibson was fired for working hard to fix the democratic deficit. My first question is to the Premier.
Point of order.
How can the provincial elections in this province be considered to be conducted in a fair and independent manner when the Progressive Conservative Party has sole authority to appoint the returning officers for the provincial elections?
The Honourable Deputy Premier.
Mr. Speaker, as the Government House Leader rose on a point of order, I'm sure it's in relation to the misinformation contained in the preamble to the question. The issue that occurred last night was before a committee of this Assembly. It is not the government, and it was the decision of that particular committee going through the usual process that committee goes through that gave rise to the decision that the Honourable Member is talking about.
The Honourable Member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That's very interesting, given that a government member on that committee announced to the press last Friday, whenever we initially had a meeting, that the gentleman was going to be fired the following week. And you know that turned out to be true. Now again, to the Premier. When Mr. Gibson refused to sign the recommendation...
Hold on, Honourable Member, just a second. The Honourable Member for Edmonton-McClellan.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for giving me the opportunity.
No, are you rising on a point of order?
Yes.
And the Government House Leader?
Same one.
Same point of order. Okay, I'll put them all down. We'll come back to it. No, we deal with it later. The Honourable Member for Edmonton-Goldbar.
Mr. Speaker, I appreciate that. When Mr. Gibson refused, and again to the Premier, when Mr. Gibson refused to sign the recommendation for the Order in Council to appoint returning officers for the two by-elections which occurred in 2007, what did the government tell Mr. Gibson?
The Honourable Deputy Premier.
Mr. Speaker, those are specifics of which I have no knowledge.
The Honourable Member.
Thank you. And again, they're in the testimony that was provided to the committee that the Honourable Member referred to earlier. Who in the Progressive Conservative headquarters was given the responsibility by the government to appoint the returning officers on Mr. Gibson's behalf?
Well, the aspect that deals with the government, Mr. Speaker, is that ultimately I believe it's an Order in Council that ultimately appoints the returning officers, and that is a government responsibility that I can comment on.